Alright, let's go. Number 10. The helmet in the vaulted tomb. In February 2026, a University of Cincinnati excavation team working near the village of Sari, in the hill country above Pylos, cleared the collapsed roof of a Mycenaean vaulted tomb and found a burial that later robbers had never reached. Among the grave goods was a leather cap studded with rows of polished boar's tusk plates, curved and sewn edge to edge, dated to roughly 1500 BCE. Sharon Stocker, the same archaeologist who co-led the 2015 discovery of the Griffin warrior a few kilometers away, oversaw its recovery. The plates were brittle. 60 years of clay pressure had flattened some of them, and the excavators lifted the assembly a fragment at a time, cataloging the order before it could collapse into powder. The helmet is not a rarity because Mycenaean armor is scarce. It is a rarity because of what it confirms about a passage most people have heard without registering. In Book 10 of the Iliad, when the warrior Meriones arms Odysseus for a night raid against the Trojan camp, Homer stops the action to describe the helmet in detail, a leather cap wound with rows of gleaming white tusks. Set in alternating rows, packed and sewn with precision, with a felt lining underneath. Homer is writing, at the earliest, in the 8th century BC. The construction he describes went out of use roughly 700 years before he composed a line of it. The Sari helmet joins a small, tightly dated cluster, fragments from the Dendra panoply. Excavated in 1960 near Argos and dated to around 1424 BCE, ivory tusk plates recovered from the shaft graves at Mycenae, and a painted plaque from Knossos showing the same construction on the head of a war goddess. Every confirmed example falls inside a narrow window, roughly the 17th through the 12th centuries BCE. After that, boar's tusk helmets vanish from the archaeological record entirely. Bronze became the standard. The tusk and leather technique was never revived, never depicted again, and never mentioned in any surviving text until Homer describes it as though he had watched one being made. A single boar's tusk helmet required 50 individual boars. Since only the largest canine on each animal was usable, cut, drilled, and set in overlapping rows that Homer's text describes moving in alternating directions across the crown. That is not a detail a poet invents to fill a line. It is a detail a poet inherits. For decades, some Homeric scholars treated the passage as a plausible but unprovable case of poetic embellishment. The argument being that a later poet, familiar with ivory work in general, could have imagined a tusked helmet without ever having preserved a genuine memory of one. That argument held until the archaeological sample grew large enough to check the details against real construction. It did not hold up. Every recovered example, from Dendra to Mycenae to Knossos to the tomb at Sari, uses the same alternating row technique Homer specifies, a construction method with no equivalent anywhere else in the ancient Mediterranean and no reason for a later poet to guess correctly by chance. What makes the Sari helmet particularly unsettling is not that it exists. It is that Homer's description survived 7 centuries of purely oral transmission. Generation after generation of singers who had never seen a tusk helmet worn in their lifetimes, and arrived at the page with the construction sequence, the felt lining, and the alternating rows all intact and correct. Bronze had replaced tusk and leather as the standard helmet material by roughly 1400 BCE. For the next 600 years, no one building armor in the Greek world had any practical reason to remember how a boar's tusk helmet was assembled. The knowledge survived anyway, carried in verse rather than in workshops, until a poet who had never held one described it precisely enough that a modern excavator, brushing soil away from an actual example, could recognize every detail Homer had specified. The helmet sits now in a conservation lab outside Pylos, tusk by tusk, in the same arrangement in which a poet who lived 700 years after it went out of fashion still knew exactly how to describe it. Number 9. The women who were named for where they came from. In the mid-1950s, the philologist John Chadwick sat with the corpus of linear B tablets recovered from the palace at Pylos and began sorting entries in the Ab and A series, ration lists, mostly recording monthly allotments of grain and figs to groups of women and children attached to the palace workshops. Chadwick had co-authored the 1952 decipherment of Linear B with Michael Ventris only a few years earlier, confirming the script recorded an early form of Greek, a discovery that had overturned a century of assumptions about who the Mycenaeans even were. Now he was doing the slower, less celebrated work, reading what the palace bureaucracy had written down, tablet by tablet. Running a finger along the syllabic signs, and noticing that many of the women's work groups were not named for their occupation. They were named for a place. The tablets record Miratija, the women of Miletus, Ki-ni Dija, the women of Kinios, Ra-mi-ni-ja, women associated with Lemnos, groups from Halicarnassos, from Chios, from the district the tablets call Oswia, a name philologists have connected to the later Greek word Asia. No other Mycenaean administrative center, not Thebes, not Knossos, has produced anything comparable. Pylos alone kept a bureaucratic record of women identified, tablet after tablet, by their Anatolian origin, and the tablet series is not a handful of stray entries. Across the AA, AB, and AD sets, the palace scribes tracked several hundred women organized into named work gangs. Each gang cross referenced against the children born to them, and the rations both were owed. The bureaucracy did not merely notice these women once. It tracked them, generation to generation, as a permanent category of palace labor. These are not diplomatic guests. The ration quantities match those given to the palace's other dependent labor groups. The women appear in the tablets as economic units, sorted by the same scribal hand that tracked bronze allocations and flax deliveries. Whatever brought them from the coast of Anatolia to a palace storeroom in the western Peloponnese, it was not trade in the ordinary sense. Someone recorded them as labor, the way a palace records anything it expects to keep using. It would be easy to explain a handful of foreign names as intermarriage, or peaceful migration, or ordinary Bronze Age mobility across the Aegean, and a number of scholars have argued exactly that, pointing out that trade and travel across the Aegean were routine, and that a woman's recorded origin does not by itself prove she arrived as a captive rather than a settler or a spouse. That explanation works for one name, or three. It becomes harder to sustain against the pattern the full tablet series shows. The ration quantities assigned to these women match the lowest tier the palace paid its unfree labor. Not the tier reserved for free dependents or married women of status, and the same coastal Anatolian toponyms recur across multiple tablet sets compiled over multiple administrative years, not as a single anomalous batch, but as a sustained category the palace bureaucracy kept refilling. But here is where the explanation becomes strained further. The specific places named in the tablets. Miletus. Knidos, Halicarnassos, the Anatolian coast, sit almost exactly where the Iliad and later Greek tradition locate the world around Troy. The historian Herodotus, writing centuries later, would claim the entire war began over the seizure of a woman. The Pylos tablets do not mention Helen. They do not mention a war. They record, in a Bronze Age palace's own accounting hand, a documented pattern of women taken from the Anatolian coast and absorbed into Mycenaean Greek households as labor. The exact demographic signature, a war of raiding along that coastline, would be expected to leave behind. The tablets do not say why the women of Miletus were in Pylos instead of Miletus. They only record that they were there, counted in fig rations, generation after generation. The ledger of a war nobody wrote down as a war. The tablets themselves survive today only because the palace that produced them burned. The same fire that destroyed the palace of Nestor around 1180 BC baked the unfired clay hard enough to preserve it for 3,000 years, meaning the only reason anyone can read the names of these women at all is that the world which had enslaved them collapsed in the same catastrophe the Trojan War tradition remembers as its aftermath. Number 8. What the bone dust said. In a clean room at Harvard Medical School, sometime before the study's 2017 publication, a researcher on Iosif Lazaridis' team positioned a small hand drill against the petrous portion of a skull. the dense protective bone behind the inner ear, which preserves ancient DNA far better than any other part of the human skeleton, and began removing bone dust in careful increments. Working slowly enough to avoid cracking bone that had survived 3,500 years underground, only to be destroyed in a single careless pass. The skeleton belonged to one of 19 ancient individuals the team had assembled genome-wide data from. Minoans excavated from Crete, Mycenaeans from mainland Greek sites, and their contemporaries from southwestern Anatolia. The petrous bone was chosen deliberately. Earlier attempts at ancient Aegean DNA, drawn from teeth and long bones, had mostly failed, degraded past readability by thousands of years in the warm, wet limestone soils of Greece and Crete. The dense petrous portion, largely ignored by earlier generations of geneticists, turned out to preserve DNA at concentrations up to 100 times higher than other skeletal material. The technique itself was only a few years old when Lazaridis' team applied it to the Aegean material. The question the team was chasing had puzzled archaeologists for more than a century. Were the Minoans and Mycenaeans, the two civilizations bracketing the Bronze Age Aegean, related to each other, or merely neighbors who happened to leave behind similarly spectacular ruins? Some earlier genetic surveys, working with lower resolution methods in the years before whole genome sequencing became practical, had produced ambiguous or contradictory signals about Aegean population continuity, and a strand of scholarship had argued that repeated later migrations, Slavic, Roman, Ottoman, would have diluted any Bronze Age signal into statistical noise. That was the expectation the Lazaridis team was testing against. It did not hold. The results, published in Nature in 2017, found that Minoans and Mycenaeans were genetically similar populations, both descended overwhelmingly, at least 3/4 of their ancestry, from the first Neolithic farmers who had settled the Aegean thousands of years earlier, with an additional strand of ancestry tracing back toward the Caucasus and Iran. But the two populations were not identical. The Mycenaeans, and only the Mycenaeans, carried an additional genetic signature connecting them to the hunter-gatherer populations of the Eurasian steppe in Eastern Europe, an inheritance the Minoans of Crete simply did not share. Modern Greeks, the study found, still carry the genetic signature of the Mycenaeans, diluted by roughly 3,000 years of subsequent migration, but never erased. This is not folklore confirmed. This is a population, definable in its genome, distinguishable from its island neighbors by a specific and traceable ancestral component. Existing at the exact time and in the exact geography, the Iliad places the Achaean confederation that sailed against Troy. Lazaridis himself, summarizing the finding, noted that the Greeks have always been a work in progress, with layer after layer of later migration added on top of, but never erasing, the Bronze Age ancestry the genome data recovered. Consider the implication. For more than a century, one line of scholarly skepticism held that Mycenaean Greece, as Homer describes it, a unified, ethnically coherent warrior culture capable of fielding a combined expedition, was itself a later poetic invention, a retrojection of classical Greek identity onto a Bronze Age world that had no such coherence. Some archaeologists argued the Mycenaean world was really a patchwork of unrelated local chiefdoms, loosely connected by trade and imitation, with no deeper genetic or ethnic unity binding them into anything Homer would have recognized as a single people capable of jointly sailing against a common enemy. The genome data does not settle whether the war happened. It settles something narrower and, in its way, more foundational. The population Homer calls Achaean was real. It was genetically distinct from its neighbors. It existed as a bounded, definable group of people, exactly where and when the tradition says it did, not a legend stitched together from disconnected local memories, but a population. Coherent enough in its ancestry that a laboratory 3,500 years later could still isolate the signature that set it apart. The bone dust is gone now, converted into sequence data stored on a server. What is left is a graph, and on that graph, 3,500 years later, the Mycenaeans still stand apart from everyone around them. exactly as the epic insisted they always had. Number 7. The names carved for a king who never sailed there. In 1964, the Egyptologist Elmar Edel was working through photographs and paper squeezes of hieroglyphic inscriptions carved into the base of a colossal statue at Qom el-Hetnan, the ruined mortuary temple of Pharaoh Amenhotep III on the west bank of the Nile opposite Luxor. The inscriptions had been known for decades, but no one had systematically decoded what the two columns of place names represented. Edel traced the cartouches with the patience of a man convinced they weren't decorative. Under the heading Keftiu, the Egyptian name for Crete, ran a column of Aegean toponyms. Beneath it, under a second heading, Tenaju, ran a second column, a list of place names that included forms Edel identified as Mycenae and Nopleon. Amenhotep III never sailed to the Aegean. Egypt in the 14th century BC did not maintain colonies in Greece. And yet somewhere in his mortuary temple's construction records, an Egyptian scribe had transcribed, with enough phonetic accuracy for a modern Egyptologist to recognize them 33 centuries later, the names of specific Mycenaean cities, not a vague notion of the islands, but Mycenae itself, and its harbor town. Not every name in the list has been identified with confidence, and Edel's own readings have been revised more than once as new fragments surfaced. A site called Amyclae, for instance, does not appear to have been an important settlement until roughly 2 centuries after Amenhotep III's reign, which some scholars have used to argue that at least part of the list reflects later editorial updating rather than a single 14th century snapshot. That objection turned out to strengthen the case rather than undercut it, once Sarosian's team confirmed physically, fragment by fragment, that portions of the inscription had in fact been recarved. The list was not a static monument. It was a working document, updated as Egypt's knowledge of the Aegean changed, which means an Egyptian scribal office was actively maintaining and correcting its intelligence on Mycenaean geography over multiple decades, centuries before the war, the way a modern foreign ministry updates a gazetteer rather than the way a temple commissions a one-time decoration. The archaeologist Horrig Sarosian's ongoing excavations at Qom el-Hetnan, resuming systematic work at the site in the early 2000s, recovered additional fragments of the statue bases and confirmed that 3 of the names in Edel's original list had at some point been recarved, evidence that the list was updated, revisited, treated as a working record rather than a one-time ornamental flourish. Scholars including Eric Klein have argued the sequence of names reads like an itinerary, the stops of an actual Egyptian diplomatic or trade expedition into the Aegean, rather than a generic list of foreign lands. What makes the Aegean list particularly difficult to dismiss is not the existence of contact between Egypt and Greece during this period. Mycenaean pottery has turned up across Egyptian sites, and Egyptian goods appear in Mycenaean tombs, so trade is not controversial, and archaeologists have documented that traffic for well over a century. What is unsettling is the specificity. A trade relationship leaves behind broken pots and the occasional scarab. A named itinerary, carved permanently into the base of a pharaoh's own memorial statue, is a different order of evidence entirely. It means an Egyptian scribal office treated the geography of Mycenaean Greece as worth recording for eternity, alongside the pharaoh's own name, in the one type of monument the Egyptians built specifically to outlast every other kind of record they kept. An Egyptian temple scribe, cataloging the pharaoh's domain for eternity, felt it necessary to name Mycenae by name, alongside its harbor, in the same era archaeologists date to the flourishing of Mycenaean shaft-grave wealth. The city Homer would later call rich in gold was already significant enough, 2 centuries before any plausible date for a Trojan War, to warrant individual mention on a pharaoh's monument 3,000 kilometers away. The list is carved in stone that still stands, half buried, at Qom el-Hetnan, still shadowed by the 2 colossal seated statues, the Colossi of Memnon, that once flanked the same mortuary temple. Sarosian's excavation continues there each season, uncovering new statue fragments in ground that has been worked on and off for well over a century. Every fragment recovered adds another name to a roster the Egyptians kept of a world Homer would later turn into legend, a roster that named Mycenae before Mycenae had anything to do with a war, simply because Mycenae, on its own, in its own moment, was already too significant for Egypt to ignore. Number 6. The inscription that named the Achaeans ASA threat. In 1896, the archaeologist Flinders Petrie was excavating at the mortuary temple of Merneptah in Thebes when his team uncovered a large granite stele, reused from an earlier monument of Amenhotep III, covered in hieroglyphic text commemorating Merneptah's military campaigns. Petrie's workmen had to reposition the 10-foot slab twice before the inscribed face could be read in usable light. And Petrie, translating on site with the help of his assistant, recognized within hours that he was looking at a king's own account of a war most Egyptologists had only known in fragments. Most of the modern attention paid to the Merneptah stele focuses on a single line near the end, the earliest known reference to a people called Israel. But the bulk of the inscription concerns a different earlier crisis, a coalition of Libyan forces and allied peoples of the sea who invaded Egypt's western frontier around 1207 BCE, and whom Merneptah's army defeated in a 6-hour battle. Among the named invaders in that coalition, the stele lists a group called the Ekwesh, fighting alongside the Teresh, the Luka, the Shurden, and the Shekelish. A roster of names that would recur, with variations, in Egyptian military records for the next 30 years. Most Egyptologists and Hittitologists who have studied the term identify Ekwesh with the Hittite name Ahiyawa, the same name the Hittite royal archives use for the Bronze Age Greek world, the linguistic ancestor of Homer's own name for his heroes, the Achaeans. If the identification holds, it means the earliest surviving written reference to Achaean Greeks describes them not sailing to a legendary siege, but marching as part of an armed coalition on Egypt's border, several decades before the war Homer would later immortalize, circumcised according to Egyptian custom for prisoners of a certain status. And numerous enough that Merneptah's own scribes bothered to count and record them among the dead. The identification is not universally accepted. Egyptian hieroglyphic script does not record vowels, and reconstructing the sound behind a transliterated name always carries some uncertainty, so a handful of scholars have argued Ekwesh could represent an unrelated Anatolian or Libyan group. The caution is fair on its own. It becomes harder to sustain once the Ekwesh are read alongside a second, larger body of evidence from a generation later. Roughly 30 years after Merneptah's stele was carved, a second and far larger set of inscriptions was cut into the walls of Ramesses III's mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, describing a coalition of sea peoples, the Peliset, Checker, Shekelish, Denyen, and Weshish, sweeping down the eastern Mediterranean coast around 1177 BCE. The inscription does not soften the scale of what happened. It describes the invading lands as united in conspiracy, sweeping down with such confidence that no power in their path, Hatti, Kode, Carchemish, Arzawa, could stand against them, all severed from the map in a single stretch of time. The Hittite Empire, protector and overlord of Wilusa, the Hittite name for Troy, collapsed within a generation of this text being carved. Here is where the roadblock complicates the picture. For decades, scholars dismissed the Sea Peoples caused the Trojan War framing as a tidy oversimplification, and they were right to. The Weshish, one of the named groups at Medinet Habu, have occasionally been linked by philologists to the same root behind Wilusa itself, but the connection remains genuinely uncertain, disputed rather than established, and no serious historian treats it as proof of anything specific. What survives the skepticism is narrower and harder to dismiss, two independent Egyptian royal inscriptions, carved decades apart by two different pharaohs. Both named the exact population the Hittites called Ahiyawa, and the Greeks would later call themselves, operating as an armed and organized military threat across the eastern Mediterranean during precisely the window scholars date the Trojan War tradition to. Not myth, not literary borrowing. Egyptian state records, carved in granite by scribes with no reason to flatter a rival civilization, independently confirming that the Achaeans were a force capable of projecting violence across the sea. The Medinet Habu inscription alone runs to the longest hieroglyphic text ever carved onto a single Egyptian monument, wall after wall of it. A scale of documentation Ramesses III reserved for the one crisis he considered existential. The stele Petrie uncovered still stands in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. The Medinet Habu reliefs are still legible on the temple walls at Luxor, weathered but unmistakable, recording an enemy neither pharaoh had any reason to invent. Quick programming note before the next entry: if you haven't subscribed yet, this is a good moment. And if you're watching from somewhere unusual, drop a comment with where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. I read every one. Number 5. The combat scene no one could have faked. On May 28, 2015, an excavation team from the University of Cincinnati, directed by the husband and wife archaeologists Jack Davis and Sharon Stocker, was working in Olive Grove northeast of the Palace of Nestor near Pylos when their trowel struck the top of a stone-lined shaft. The team had been expanding their survey beyond the palace itself, testing ground that earlier excavators had passed over as unpromising. Within days it was clear they had found an intact Bronze Age burial, undisturbed by looters, for roughly 3,500 years, a rarity almost unheard of in a region where every prominent Mycenaean tomb had been emptied by robbers within a few centuries of burial. Over the following months, the team recovered more than 1,400 objects: bronze weapons with ivory hilts, gold cups, silver vessels, 1,000 beads of semi-precious stone, and 4 Minoan gold signet rings. Stocker later said the team had hardly dared to hope they had found something the ancient robbers had missed. The tomb's occupant, a man in his early 30s buried around 1450 BC, had been laid to rest with a bronze sword, a boar's tusk helmet of his own, and 4 Minoan gold signet rings depicting ritual scenes that had no precedent on the Greek mainland. Evidence. Davis and Stocker would later argue that Mycenaean elites were absorbing Minoan religious and artistic culture wholesale a full generation before the palatial period most historians associate with the height of Mycenaean power. The team did not find the grave of Nestor, the wise king Homer places at Pylos during the war, or of his father Neleus. What they found was earlier, and in its own way, more foundational, the burial of one of the men who helped build the world that would eventually produce a king like Nestor at all. Among the recovered objects was a small banded agate sealstone, encrusted in limestone and barely recognizable as anything more than a pebble. It took conservators more than a year of cleaning before its surface became legible. What emerged, once photographed and drawn under magnification, was a combat scene of such extraordinary fineness, figures rendered with anatomical precision. Muscle and tendon and weaponry all resolved in detail as small as 0.5 millimeter, that Davis and Stocker wrote they had gradually realized, with rising disbelief, that they were looking at a masterpiece. Craftsmanship at this level of miniature realism was not thought to have existed anywhere in the Aegean world for another 1,000 years. The scene the Pylos combat agate depicts is not generic battle. It shows a warrior, armed only with a sword, bent over a fallen or falling opponent, gripping him by the crest of his helmet and using the leverage to render him powerless, while a second enemy already lies dead at his feet, when the find was first announced. Some classicists were reluctant to draw any direct line between a piece of Minoan-influenced glyptic art and a specific passage of Homeric verse composed nearly 1,000 years later, cautioning that combat imagery of this general kind existed across the wider Bronze Age Mediterranean, and that any resemblance to a later epic scene could easily be coincidence. The caution was reasonable on its face. It weakened considerably once scholars studying the seal's iconography began comparing it clause by clause against the Iliad's Book 3 duel between Menelaus and Paris, where Menelaus seizes his opponent by the horsehair crest of his helmet, using it as leverage to drag him off balance. The exact mechanical detail, not just the general subject of combat, that the agate depicts in miniature. The seal predates the Iliad by roughly 1,000 years. What makes the Pylos combat agate particularly difficult to explain away is not simply that it is beautiful, or even that it is old. It is that the specific grappling motion, the crest seizure, the leverage move used to disable an armored opponent, appears in a piece of glyptic art from roughly 1450 BC and then resurfaces, independently, as a named combat technique in an oral epic composed centuries later, after 700 years of transmission, with no writing to anchor it. Either the technique itself was a genuine remembered piece of Bronze Age battlefield practice, passed down through generations of singers describing real warfare, or two entirely unconnected artists separated by a millennium happened to invent the identical maneuver. The tomb that held the agate sits beside the palace of the king Homer calls Nestor, wise counselor of the Achaean army at Troy, the same king who, in the epic, is the only Greek leader old enough to have fought a full generation before the war itself. The seal itself now travels between museums, most recently exhibited at the Getty Villa, protected behind glass, examined by visitors who need magnification to see what its owner's contemporaries carved without it, 3 centuries before the Bronze Age world that produced it had even reached the wealth Homer would later describe at Troy. Number 4. The mask that predated the man it was named for. In August 1876, Heinrich Schliemann began excavating inside the citadel walls of Mycenae, working under the technical supervision of the Greek archaeologist Panagiotis Stamatakis, who filed repeated formal complaints about Schliemann's habit of racing ahead of proper documentation. Schliemann's crews exposed a ring of standing stone slabs just inside the Lion Gate, 90 feet across, and within it, over the following months, uncovered a series of deep vertical shaft graves cut into the bedrock. By the close of the season, his team had recovered 19 burials, 9 men, 8 women, 2 children, along with roughly 15 kilograms of gold, diadems, breastplates, ornate bronze swords with cast lion hunt scenes inlaid in gold and yellow, silver vessels, an ostrich egg rhyton carved with dolphins, and, in shaft grave fee, 2 gold funerary masks. Stamatakis' field notes describe a man in a hurry, unwilling to pause for proper stratigraphic recording, more interested in reaching the gold than in documenting the sequence of burials around it. A habit that had already cost Schliemann dearly once before, at Hisarlik, where his impatience destroyed the very archaeological layers later excavators most needed intact. Schliemann later claimed to have telegraphed the king of Greece with the words, "I have gazed upon the face of Agamemnon." The story has become so entangled with legend that Schliemann himself, in his own contemporaneous letters, never formally identified the mask by that name. A letter of his instead describes the round-faced specimen from the same grave, not the more angular mask now famous under Agamemnon's name, as the one that reminded him of the king he had imagined. The association attached itself to the wrong object almost immediately, and neither Schliemann nor anyone else in 1876 bothered to correct it. Because the distinction hardly mattered next to the scale of what had come out of the ground, shaft grave after shaft grave, each one packed with more gold than the last, a discovery so far beyond what anyone expected from a supposedly legendary hill town, that precision about which mask belonged to which skeleton felt almost beside the point. Here is where the roadblock arrives, and it is a serious one. Later carbon dating and stylistic analysis placed Grave Circle A at approximately 1550 to 1500 BC, 300 to 400 years before any plausible date for a historical Trojan War. Whoever the man buried in Shaft Grave 5 was, he could not have been Agamemnon. He lived and died centuries before the war Homer describes. For decades, this dating problem has been used, fairly, to puncture the popular myth that Schliemann found the literal bones of Homer's king, and it should be used that way. The identification was always wrong, and pretending otherwise does no service to the actual evidence. But here is where the case reverses, and hits harder for it. The mask's premature identification was always the wrong question. What Grave Circle A proves is not the existence of one man, but the existence of a civilization already staggeringly wealthy, already burying its warrior elite with bronze weapons, gold death masks, and libation channels carved to let descendants pour wine directly onto the dead. 3 to 4 centuries before the war, it would later be immortalized for fighting. A second grave circle, designated B, was found outside the citadel walls by Greek archaeologists in the early 1950s. Its burial's older still, and together the two circles trace an unbroken sequence of accumulating royal wealth at Mycenae, stretching back even further than Schliemann's first trench suggested. A dynasty of gold that had been building for generations before anyone in it could plausibly have marched on Troy. Homer's most famous epithet for the city is not incidental. He calls it, again and again, Mycenae rich in gold, a description composed roughly 700 years after the shaft graves were sealed, by a poet with no access to them, describing a city whose defining trait, recovered from underground in 1876, turned out to be exactly that, gold, in quantities that still stagger the museum visitors who see it displayed in Athens today. The mask of Agamemnon was never Agamemnon's mask. It didn't need to be. It confirms something older, and, in its way, more important, that the city Homer built his entire war narrative around was not a poetic invention grafted onto an unremarkable hill town. It was already, centuries before any war, exactly what its epithet claimed. A poet composing 700 years after Grave Circle A was sealed shut, had no excavation to consult and no reason to know that 15 kilograms of gold lay, buried a few meters inside the citadel wall. He simply inherited the description, the way a family inherits a story about an ancestor's fortune long after the money itself has been spent, and it happened to be true. The mask hangs now in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, behind glass, still wearing a name that belongs to a war fought 400 years after the man beneath it was already dust. Number 3. The cities that were already ruins when Homer named them. Sometime in the mid-20th century, teams from the British School at Athens, following the survey methodology later compiled by Richard Hope Simpson in his study of Mycenaean geography, walked the hillsides of mainland Greece with the 265 lines of the Iliad's catalog of ships in hand, checking each named settlement against the physical archaeological record on the ground. What they were testing was a specific and falsifiable claim, that the catalog, the long, famously tedious list in Book 2 of the Iliad, enumerating the contingents and ships each Achaean kingdom sent to Troy, was not a poetic invention of Homer's own era, but a fossilized geographic document, preserving the political map of Greece as it had existed centuries before Homer sang a word of it. The test worked. Site after site named in the catalog turned out to correspond to genuine late Bronze Age settlements. Many of them, crucially, places that had been abandoned, destroyed, or reduced to insignificance by the time Homer's own audience would have heard the poem performed in the 8th century BCE. The philologist Denis Page, compiling the evidence in his 1959 study, History and the Homeric Iliad, cataloged dozens of these correspondences and asked the obvious question: why would a poet composing for an 8th century audience preserve, in precise geographic order, the names and relative importance of Bronze Age towns that had crumbled into obscurity 300 or 400 years before he was born? The catalog awards Pylos, Nestor's kingdom, a modest 90 ships, respectable, but far below the contingents credited to Mycenae and Argos, a ranking that matches the archaeological footprint of the Palace of Nestor almost exactly. A significant but secondary regional power, never the equal of the Argolids' great citadels. A poet inventing the geopolitics of Greece from his own 8th century vantage point, with no Bronze Age census to consult, had no reason to get that relative ranking right. Not every line in the catalog survived the transmission untouched, and the roadblock here is worth taking seriously. The catalog's treatment of Athens. Led by a minor figure named Menestius, and granted a prominence many scholars considered disproportionate to Athens' actual Bronze Age importance, along with the inclusion of Salamis immediately afterward, has long been suspected of later insertion, a plausible piece of political flattery added centuries after the fact, when Athens wanted a documented claim to the island of Salamis in a dispute with Megara. If a poet could quietly slip Athens and Salamis into an otherwise ancient list, the argument goes, how much of the rest of the catalog can be trusted as genuinely old? The answer, once scholars isolated the suspect lines, is that the padding is detectable precisely because it stands out. The Athens and Salamis passages are stylistically looser, metrically distinct, and geographically vague compared to the tightly compressed. Specific entries surrounding them, sites named with harbor details, local epithets, and exact ship, counts that only make sense if the poet or the tradition behind him knew the Bronze Age geography being described. The insertion proves the rest of the list wasn't invented the same way. It proves the opposite, that later editors treated the catalog as a fixed, authoritative document stable enough that they had to smuggle their additions in, rather than simply reworking the whole thing to fit contemporary politics. One example carries unusual weight. The catalog lists a contingent from a place called Hypothebai, meaning below Thebes, not Thebes itself. Classical tradition recorded, separately from Homer, that Thebes had been sacked in a war 1 generation before the Trojan expedition, by a group of warriors called the Epigonoi. Archaeological excavation at Thebes has independently confirmed that the palatial center there, with its own linear B administration, was destroyed at the very end of the late Bronze Age period archaeologists label Le Eeb. Shortly before the destruction of Troy Via, the layer most scholars associate with the war itself. The poet naming below Thebes rather than Thebes was not being poetically vague. He was describing a city that had already been leveled by the time of the war he was about to narrate, and later Greek tradition, working from a completely separate line of transmission, remembered the same sequence of events independently. For that convergence to be coincidental, the coincidence would have to extend not just to one ruined city correctly placed in a war narrative, but to dozens of them, town after town in the catalog's 265 lines, each checked and rechecked against the archaeological record over decades of fieldwork, each landing with remarkable consistency on settlements whose Bronze Age importance had already faded by the time of Homer's own world. The catalog of ships is, by any modern standard, bad poetry, a list, without incident, without dialogue, a recitation of names most audiences would find difficult to sit through. And that may be precisely why it survived unaltered. It was not composed for entertainment. It was inherited, verse by verse, as a piece of geographic memory too structurally rigid to improvise, preserved by singers who had no idea most of what they were reciting no longer existed. Somewhere in the transmission, an oral tradition that could freely invent dialogue, embellish combat, and expand entire episodes of the war treated this one section as too load-bearing to touch. A fossil of Bronze Age political geography, embedded whole inside a poem that otherwise felt free to reshape almost everything else about the story it was telling. Number 2. The letter that settled the argument. At Hattusa, the ruined Hittite capital in central Anatolia, German excavators working in the early 20th century recovered tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets from the Royal Archive, among them a badly damaged text now catalogued as 6th 181 and preserved on a tablet designated Cub 14.3, joined with a second fragment, VAT 6692. Recovered separately and matched decades later by philologists piecing together the empire's scattered correspondence. The text is fragmentary, its opening lost, its authorship debated between the Hittite kings Muwatalli II and his brother Hattusili III. Its recipient never named, because the portion of the tablet that would have identified him has not survived. Scholars call it, after a name that does appear in the text, the Tawagalawa letter, a name most Hittitologists connect to the Greek Ediacules, brother of the letter's addressee, though even that identification remains contested. The immediate occasion for the letter was a manhunt. A renegade Anatolian warlord named Pia Maradu had spent years destabilizing the Hittites' western frontier, leading a failed rebellion in the Luca lands, raiding the coastal city of Milawanda, the Hittite name for Miletus, and repeatedly slipping across the border into territory the Hittite king considered under Ahiawan protection. By the time of the letter, Pia Maradu had fled into Ahiawan-controlled ground entirely, and the Hittite king was left proposing 3 options to his counterpart: hand the warlord over, expel him outright, or grant him asylum on the strict condition that he cause no further trouble. No reply survives. What the following decades show, in the archaeological and textual record, is a steady increase in Ahiyawan influence along the Anatolian coast, which most historians read as evidence the appeal was quietly ignored. Buried inside the damaged correspondence, in a passage requesting the extradition of a troublesome renegade named Piyamaradu, the Hittite king pauses to remind the letter's recipient, a king of a land called Ahiyawa. Addressed throughout with the term my brother, a diplomatic honorific the Hittites reserved only for the rulers of Egypt and Babylonia, powers they considered their equals, of something the two of them had already resolved. The line, translated by the Hittitologist Gary Beckman and cited across decades of subsequent scholarship, reads, "The king of Hatti has persuaded me about the matter of the land of Walusa, concerning which he and I were hostile to one another, and we have made peace." Walusa is the Hittite name for the region archaeologists identify, on independent linguistic and geographic grounds, with Troy. The Hittite king is not writing a legend. He is closing out a diplomatic dispute file. Somewhere in the mid-13th century BC, the Hittite Empire and a foreign power the Hittites regarded as a legitimate royal equal had gone to war. The letter uses a Hittite verb that could describe anything from open combat to a prolonged hostile standoff, specifically over the land of Walusa. And by the time this letter was written, that war was already over, already resolved, already a settled matter of record between two chancelleries. This is not a poet's memory of a war filtered through 8 centuries of oral performance. This is a contemporary Bronze Age diplomatic archive, excavated from the ground at Hattusa, written by a Hittite king with no stake in Greek poetic tradition and no reason to invent a conflict that hadn't happened. Independently confirming that a war took place over Walusa, fought between the Hittite sphere and a power called Ahiyawa, the same name philologists agree that lies behind Homer's Achaeans. And the tone in which the Hittite king writes matters as much as the content. Diplomatic correspondence of this era followed a rigid hierarchy. Hittite kings addressed lesser vassal rulers as subordinates, issuing commands rather than requests. The term of address reserved for Ahiyawa's king in this letter, brother, was a title the Hittite chancellery extended to exactly 2 other powers on earth, Egypt and Babylonia. Whoever the Ahiyawan king was, the Hittite Empire did not consider him a minor irritant. It considered him an equal, worth placating, worth writing to personally, worth closing out an old war with formally rather than simply declaring it over by decree. What makes the Tagalawa letter the single hardest piece of evidence in the entire dossier to argue away is that it requires no interpretation of myth, no matching of place names to ruins, no genetic modeling. It is a government record referencing an actual, resolved war over an actual identified place, written by the one Bronze Age power in the region with the administrative habit of writing everything down. The Hittite bureaucracy that produced this letter left behind an archive of tens of thousands of tablets at Hattusa alone, and in the surviving fraction that scholars have been able to translate, Walusa appears again and again in the Alexandu Treaty and the Manapa-Tarhunta letter. In the Milawata letter, a minor vassal state that, judging strictly by how often the empire's central chancellery felt the need to write about it, was never as minor as its size on a map would suggest. No comparable archive survives from the Greek side of the conflict. Everything the Mycenaean world might have written about its own war with Walusa, if it wrote anything down at all beyond palace ration tablets, was lost when its palaces burned. The only contemporary bureaucratic record of the war that survives at all belongs to the enemy's protector, not to the winning side. The tablet itself sits catalogued in the Hittite collection, its missing opening lines never recovered, its author's identity still debated, its recipient's name lost forever to a broken corner of clay. What survives is the sentence that mattered, a war over Walusa, already fought, already ended, mentioned only in passing. The offhand way a scribe notes something everyone already knew had happened. Number 1. the treaty that named the king who shouldn't have had a name. In 1906, the German Assyriologist Hugo Winkler began excavating at Boaski, the site of the ancient Hittite capital Hattusa, working with a small crew through the summer heat of the Anatolian plateau. When his workmen broke into a chamber near the citadel's main structure, Winkler found the floor covered, layer on layer, with fired clay tablets, the royal archive. Undisturbed since the city's own destruction at the end of the Bronze Age, thousands of documents still stacked in something close to the order the Hittite bureaucracy had shelved them in more than 3,000 years earlier. He did not yet know the language would take another generation of scholars to fully unlock. He knew, holding the first tablets up to the light, that he had found the administrative memory of an empire modern historians had barely known existed. Among the treaties eventually recovered from that room, published in 1920 and given a full scholarly interpretation between 1922 and 1924, was a 21-clause diplomatic agreement between the Hittite great king Muwatalli the Sioux and the ruler of a vassal state called Wilusa. The ruler is named 23 separate times across the text as Alexandu. The treaty, sealed around 1280 BCE, is not a literary text. It is a legal instrument, a vassal treaty of the ordinary Hittite type, listing divine witnesses, outlining mutual military obligations, promising Muwatalli's protection to Alexandu's designated heirs for 2 generations. Muwatalli recalls, within the text itself, that Alexandu's predecessor, Kukuni, had maintained friendly relations with Muwatalli's own grandfather Suppiluliuma I, roughly a century earlier, meaning the treaty situates Wilusa inside a documented Hittite diplomatic relationship stretching back well over a century, before the war Homer would later describe. The treaty specifies, in unusual detail, that Muwatalli and his descendants will defend Alexandu's line for 2 full generations, that Alexandu is free to designate the sons of concubines as his legitimate heirs, and that no revolt within his own family will be permitted to depose him while the Hittite king lives. The language of a great king propping up a client ruler whose grip on power was, by the treaty's own admission, less secure than his predecessors. One of the divine guarantors invoked to enforce the treaty is a god the text calls Apollonius, a name a number of Hittitologists have connected to the Greek god Apollo, patron and defender of Troy throughout the entire Iliad. A second local guarantor, a spring goddess the Hittites call Kaskalkur, is tied by the treaty to a specific water cave beneath the city itself, a cave archaeologists have since located and confirmed still exists in the bedrock beneath the site identified as Wilusa. Here's the detail that has occupied philologists for a century. Alexandu is not a Hittite name, and it is not an Anatolian name of any known local pattern. Scholars, including those who first published the treaty, have noted its likely derivation from Greek, Alexandros, defender of men. And Alexandros is not an obscure name in the Homeric tradition. It is the other name, the name used interchangeably with Paris throughout the entire Iliad, for the Trojan prince whose actions the poem holds directly responsible for starting the war. Consider the implications squarely. This is not a poetic character showing up in an unrelated document by coincidence of sound. This is a Hittite state treaty, dated on independent grounds to roughly 1 to 2 generations before the war tradition places it Troy, naming an actual, historical, vassal ruler of the actual city the war was fought over. Using the actual alternate name the Iliad assigns to the man whose actions triggered that war. Under a Hittite king, who explicitly notes that Alexandu did not inherit the throne through ordinary succession, that his rise to power was irregular, unlike his named Hittite titled predecessors Kukuni and Walmu. A foreign-named outsider ascending to the kingship of Troy through unconventional means. 1 to 2 generations before a war remembered for centuries afterward as having been caused by a Trojan prince named Alexander. Later Hittite correspondence, including the Milawata letter, would go on to record that Wilusa's throne remained unstable for generations after Alexandu, with at least one subsequent king, Walmu, deposed and later reinstalled by direct Hittite intervention. A pattern of chronic instability at exactly the throne later tradition would fix its entire war narrative upon. No Greek source produced this document. No poet, no oral tradition, no later mythographer had access to the Hittite royal archive at Hattusa, sealed and buried for 3,000 years until Winkler's shovels reached it in 1906. The correspondence between the treaty and the epic exists entirely independent of Homer, verified from the opposite side of the war, in the administrative language of the empire that had backed Troy as its vassal for over a century. Set beside everything else in this record, the pattern sharpens rather than repeats. The Tawagalawa letter, on its own, proved only that a war over Wailusa had happened and had already ended by the time of its writing. It named no combatants beyond 2 royal titles. The Pylos tablets, on their own, proved only that Mycenaean palaces absorbed women from the Anatolian coast as a matter of sustained administrative routine. Neither, alone, puts a face on the war. The Alexandu treaty does. It places an actual, named, foreign-born ruler on the actual throne of the actual city, carrying the one name later Greek tradition would insist belonged to the prince whose action started everything. A coincidence of name, place, era, and irregular succession that no single document in this dossier, on its own, could have supplied. The tablet recording the Alexandu Treaty is cataloged today in the Hittite collections drawn from the Boaski excavations, its 21 clauses still legible. Its named king still exactly who he was 3,300 years ago. A foreign-born ruler of Wailusa, protected by treaty, guaranteed by a god the Trojans would later call their defender. Carrying into the historical record the one name no Greek poet needed to invent, because a Hittite scribe had already written it down first. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.